Everyone thinks the Segway died. It's become one of the most reliable punchlines in modern technology history, the poster child for hype gone wrong, a two-wheeled monument to Silicon Valley excess that promised to reinvent the city and instead became a mall cop's favorite prop. Production officially ended in 2020. The company that made it hasn't existed under that name in years. By every obvious measure, the Segway looks like a corpse, and most retrospectives treat it exactly that way. A cautionary tale, a 5-point list of reasons a brilliant inventor's dream fell apart. But that framing misses the actual ending of this story, because the technology inside the Segway didn't die at all. It went quiet, changed hands, and ended up underneath your feet the last time you rented an electric scooter off a city sidewalk. The company failed. The idea won, and almost nobody tells it that way. If you're new here, this channel exists to dig up the real story behind the brands and technologies everyone thinks they already understand, the ones where the popular version turns out to be only half of what actually happened. If that sounds like your kind of rabbit hole, hit subscribe, because the second half of the Segway story is a lot stranger and a lot more interesting than the collapse everyone remembers. To understand why the Segway generated so much hype before a single unit ever reached a customer, you have to understand who was building it, because Dean Kamen wasn't some venture-backed founder chasing his first success. He was already one of the most accomplished inventors in American medicine by the time he turned his attention to personal transportation, and that track record is the reason the entire technology press treated his next project as inevitable genius rather than speculative risk. Kamen dropped out of college in the 1970s, but not because he lacked direction. While still a student, he invented a wearable infusion pump that could deliver medication to patients in small, steady, programmable doses instead of the periodic large injections that had been standard practice up to that point. That single invention transformed treatment for a range of chronic conditions and became the foundation of a company called AutoSyringe, which Kamen sold in his early 30s for a substantial sum. He didn't retire on the proceeds. He reinvested them into a research and development company built specifically to keep inventing medical devices that solved problems other engineers had either given up on or never attempted. Over the following years, that company's output included a portable dialysis machine dramatically smaller than the room-sized units hospitals had relied on for decades, expanding access to a life-sustaining treatment for patients who previously had to travel to a clinic multiple times a week, and a flexible heart stent that improved outcomes for cardiac patients across the world. This wasn't a hobbyist tinkering in a garage. This was a documented, verifiable pattern of an engineer solving problems that directly extended and improved human lives, again and again, for over a decade, before anyone outside the medical device industry had ever heard his name. The idea that would eventually become the Segway emerged out of that same problem-solving instinct, not out of any grand ambition to reinvent urban transportation. In 1990, Kamen witnessed a man in a wheelchair struggling to get the chair up over a curb, a mundane obstacle that able-bodied pedestrians never think twice about, and that fundamentally restricts where wheelchair users can go without assistance. That observation led Kamen's team to develop an advanced robotic wheelchair called the iBot, a 6-wheeled device equipped with gyroscopic balancing technology that allowed it to climb stairs, navigate curbs, and even raise itself onto 2 wheels so the user could sit at eye level with someone standing beside them. It was, by any measure, a genuinely remarkable piece of engineering, one built to solve a real and specific problem faced by a population that mainstream consumer technology routinely ignored. It was while refining the iBot's balancing systems that Kamen's team realized the same core technology, The same gyroscopes and motor controls and self-balancing algorithms that let a wheelchair climb a curb could be adapted into something else entirely, a compact, upright, self-balancing personal vehicle for able-bodied users. That adaptation became the project that would eventually be revealed to the world as the Segway. Kamen's public image only added to the sense that whatever he built next was going to matter. He was already known as an eccentric, larger-than-life figure even before the Segway existed, someone who commuted by helicopter, wore denim almost exclusively regardless of the occasion, and owned his own private island off the coast of Connecticut, that he had essentially turned into a personal research compound and libertarian thought experiment, complete with its own flag, currency, and constitution, as something of an ongoing joke among his inner circle. That combination of genuine engineering credibility and eccentric personal mythology made him an unusually compelling figure for the technology press to build a narrative around, because he read less like a typical corporate executive and more like a character out of Golden Age science fiction, the kind of inventor who tinkers in isolation and periodically emerges with something that reshapes the world. The iBot itself deserves more attention than it typically gets in retellings of this story, because it wasn't a minor side project on the way to the Segway. It represented years of dedicated engineering work solving problems specific to wheelchair users, problems that mainstream consumer technology companies had largely ignored because the addressable market was smaller and the engineering challenges were significantly harder than anything involved in most consumer electronics. Climbing stairs safely, balancing on two wheels reliably enough to trust a person's physical safety to the mechanism, navigating uneven terrain without tipping, these were genuinely difficult control systems problems, and Kamen's team solved them well enough that the iBot eventually received regulatory clearance and reached the market as a legitimate medical device, giving wheelchair users a level of independence and mobility that simply hadn't existed before. That the same underlying gyroscopic balancing research could be pulled out of a medical device context and reapplied to a mainstream consumer transportation device is itself a genuinely elegant piece of technology transfer, the kind of cross-pollination between specialized and mainstream applications that shows up again and again throughout the history of consumer electronics. Kamen himself did nothing to lower expectations, and in fact actively raised them, reportedly comparing the future impact of his new invention to what the calculator had done to the pencil and paper, and predicting it would do for walking what the automobile had done to the horse and buggy. Statements like that, from a man with his specific credibility, didn't read as marketing hyperbole. They read as an informed prediction from someone who had already reshaped multiple corners of medicine. Before the public even knew what the invention was, speculation about it had already spiraled into a full-blown cultural moment, and this is where the story starts to diverge sharply from ordinary product hype cycles, because the people fueling the speculation weren't tabloid writers or overzealous bloggers. They were some of the most credible names in business and technology. Steve Jobs, having been shown an early version of the device before its public unveiling, reportedly predicted it could become as significant as the personal computer itself. An almost unthinkable comparison coming from the man who had built his career on exactly that category of world-changing technology. Jeff Bezos, at the time already a defining figure of the internet economy, publicly called it one of the most anticipated product introductions in history. John Doerr, a venture capitalist whose track record included early, formative investments in companies like Amazon and Google, put his own money into the project and predicted it would reach $1 billion in sales faster than any product in history. A genuinely staggering claim from someone whose entire profession depended on accurately judging which technologies were actually going to matter. The secrecy around the project only intensified the speculation, and the project even had an internal codename, Ginger, that leaked into public circulation and became a subject of ongoing fascination in its own right. Journalists covering the technology beat spent months trying to piece together fragments of information from patent filings, supplier rumors, and second-hand accounts from anyone who might have glimpsed the prototype. Because almost nothing concrete leaked before the official reveal, the public filled the vacuum with wild guesses, ranging from some kind of teleportation device to other pieces of pure science fiction. The speculation became significant enough to work its way into mainstream popular culture in its own right, including an episode of the animated series South Park that aired in 2001, built specifically around the frenzy of anticipation surrounding the mystery invention rather than around the actual product itself, since the actual product hadn't even been revealed yet. That's a genuinely unusual milestone for any piece of hardware to reach, generating enough cultural momentum to become satire before the public even knew what it was. The hype had become entirely detached from the actual product, because nobody outside a small circle had any idea what the actual product was. By the time it was finally revealed on national television in December of 2001, the device had to compete not with what it genuinely was, an impressively engineered but fundamentally modest two-wheeled personal transporter, but with the fantastical expectations an entire media ecosystem had spent months constructing on its behalf. Almost nothing could have lived up to that build-up, and the Segway didn't. That gap between expectation and reality is where most retrospectives of this story stop, treating the disappointing reveal as the beginning of the end. But the deeper problem wasn't really the hype, it was what happened next, in the actual business decisions made after the reveal, decisions that get far less attention than the hype cycle, but that did significantly more lasting damage. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how expectation, engineering, and business strategy collided, consider subscribing, because we're just getting to the part of the story that actually explains why the technology survived, even though the company didn't. Kamen's genuine strength, demonstrated repeatedly across his medical device career, was invention itself, not manufacturing at scale or consumer sales. And for most of his career, he hadn't needed those skills, because his previous breakthroughs had followed a consistent pattern. Kamen's company would invent the device, and then an established, experienced partner would handle manufacturing and distribution. The infusion pump had gone through established medical distribution channels. The wheelchair technology had been produced and sold in partnership with Johnson & Johnson, a company with decades of experience bringing complex medical devices to market. That division of labor let Kamen focus entirely on what he was demonstrably excellent at. For the Segway, that pattern broke. Kamen built an entirely new, standalone company to manufacture and sell the device directly, rather than partnering with an established consumer transportation or retail company that already understood how to bring a new category of product to mass market. It's a decision that reflects just how much confidence Kamen had in the invention, but confidence in the product doesn't automatically translate into competence in the surrounding business functions the product actually needed to succeed. The consequences showed up almost immediately in how the launch itself was handled. Steve Jobs, one of the few outsiders given a preview before the public reveal, reportedly offered direct advice that the company largely didn't take. He suggested launching with a single, simple model rather than multiple variants, a philosophy that closely mirrored the product simplification strategy he was simultaneously applying to Apple's own struggling lineup at the time. Segway launched with 2 models instead. Jobs also reportedly critiqued the device's traditional, unremarkable physical appearance as a poor visual match for the genuinely novel technology inside it, feedback the company also didn't meaningfully act on through the design's public life. And where Jobs advised a large, dramatic public launch to maximize the moment's cultural momentum, the company instead rolled the product out slowly and cautiously, initially restricting sales to large institutional buyers, like police departments, corporate campuses, and theme parks, rather than everyday consumers. The ordinary public couldn't actually purchase a Segway until almost a full year after the television reveal, by which point the enormous wave of anticipation the tech and business press had spent months building had already crested and started to recede. Beyond the launch strategy, more fundamental practical problems worked against the product from the start. It wasn't legal to ride on sidewalks in many jurisdictions, a regulatory obstacle the company spent significant resources lobbying to change with limited success. It required both hands to operate, making it impractical for anyone who needed to carry something while riding. Its battery allowed for roughly 12 miles of range before requiring a recharge. And it was expensive, launching at around $5,000, a price point the company's own former vice president of marketing later publicly acknowledged had been badly out of step with what the market was willing to pay. That price wasn't arbitrary or greedy pricing either. The battery technology and motor systems required to make the self-balancing mechanism work reliably were genuinely expensive to engineer and manufacture, particularly since the company chose to manufacture domestically in New Hampshire rather than pursuing the lower-cost overseas manufacturing that many contemporary consumer electronics companies were already shifting toward. That decision preserved manufacturing jobs and quality control, close to the company's engineering team, but it also meant the unit economics never worked in the product's favor at a price point ordinary consumers could stomach. There was also a persistent financial tension running underneath the entire operation that rarely gets discussed alongside the more visible marketing and pricing missteps. Before the product had even launched, the company had already been valued at roughly $650 million during an early funding round. An enormous number for a company that hadn't sold a single unit yet and had no proven revenue model to point to. Kamen, however, was reportedly unwilling to give up more than about 15% ownership of the company in exchange for that capital, a level of founder control that limited how much outside capital the business could realistically raise in its critical early years. The result was a company operating with genuinely enormous public expectations and a valuation to match, but without the deep financial reserves that a less founder-controlled structure might have provided to absorb the launch missteps, weather the slow sales ramp, and fund the years of sustained marketing and lobbying effort that might have eventually built the sidewalk-legal, mainstream-priced version of the product the original hype had promised. A series of high-profile public accidents compounded the reputational damage over the following years. A sitting president lost his balance and fell off one during a public appearance in 2003. The television host stumbled off one on her own talk show while demonstrating it in 2010. A cameraman riding one during an Olympic victory lap collided with a champion sprinter in 2015. An incident replayed constantly across news broadcasts and social media. These moments were widely circulated, turned into recurring punchlines, and steadily eroded whatever remained of the device's original futuristic image, transforming it in the public imagination from breakthrough technology into physical comedy prop. Popular culture accelerated that transformation well beyond the accident footage itself. A recurring television character became defined in part by riding one around, while embodying a specific brand of oblivious, privileged laziness that the device had somehow become shorthand for. A prominent comedic musician featured one prominently in a music video built around mocking exactly that stereotype. A hit comedy film built an entire recurring visual joke around a mall security guard patrolling on one, cementing an image that, for an enormous segment of the population, became the single most immediate association the word Segway would ever produce, completely displacing whatever futuristic connotations the original hype cycle had built. Even the company's own internal messaging seemed to acknowledge how far the cultural perception had drifted from the original vision. Employees reportedly insisted customers and journalists refer to the device by its formal name rather than call it a scooter, a distinction that, however technically accurate, had almost no effect on how the broader public had already decided to think and talk about it. By the estimated end of its run as a standalone consumer product, the Segway had sold somewhere in the range of only 140,000 units total, a genuinely small number for a device that had once been predicted to outsell every product in business history. Judged purely as the personal transportation revolution it was originally pitched as, becoming as common a sight on city streets as bicycles or cars, it was an unambiguous commercial failure. That's the part of the story that gets told constantly, in listicle format, as one of the great cautionary tales of overhyped technology. But here's where the popular version of this story stops looking at what actually happened next, and that's the part worth paying much closer attention to. In 2015, the Segway company was acquired by Ninebot, a Chinese robotics and personal mobility firm. The circumstances of that acquisition are almost stranger than the sale itself. Just months earlier, Segway had filed a formal patent infringement complaint against Ninebot, accusing the company of copying its core self-balancing technology in Ninebot's own line of personal transporters. Rather than fighting that dispute out through prolonged litigation, Ninebot, backed by substantial investment from Chinese smartphone giant Xiaomi, along with venture firm Sequoia Capital, simply raised enough capital to acquire Segway outright, folding the very company that had accused it of patent theft into its own operations. This is where the story most retrospectives treat as an ending was actually a transformation. Ninebot didn't acquire Segway to preserve the original $5,000 self-balancing personal transporter as a standalone consumer product. It acquired Segway for its underlying technology, its patent portfolio, and crucially, the brand recognition the Segway name still carried, even after the original product's commercial disappointment. And Ninebot then did something the original Segway company never successfully managed. It found the technology's actual mass-market application. That application wasn't a two-wheeled personal transporter competing with cars and bicycles for everyday commuting. It was the electric kick scooter, a smaller, cheaper, dramatically simpler descendant of the same underlying balance and motor control technology, built for an entirely different use case: short, single-person urban trips, rented rather than owned, unlocked through a smartphone app rather than purchased outright for thousands of dollars. That shift in business model turns out to be just as important as the shift in hardware. The original Segway had failed in large part because it asked an ordinary consumer to spend $5,000 up front on a device with limited practical range and legally murky sidewalk access. The scooter share model eliminated nearly all of that friction at once. Nobody needed to own the hardware, worry about storage, or absorb the maintenance cost. They just needed a smartphone, a few dollars, and a short trip to make. The exact profile of the sub-5-mile urban journey that, as it happens, makes up the overwhelming majority of trips people actually take within a city. Ninebot's scooters, sold and marketed jointly under the combined Segway Ninebot brand, became the default hardware supplier for the wave of electric scooter-sharing startups that exploded across American and European cities starting around 2017. Bird, the company that essentially launched the modern scooter share category by dropping a handful of scooters on the sidewalks of Santa Monica, built its earliest fleets using Xiaomi and Segway Ninebot hardware before eventually commissioning its own custom vehicles. Lime, Bird's largest early competitor, relied on the same supplier relationship in its own formative years. For a period in the industry's early growth, Segway Ninebot wasn't just a participant in the scooter share boom. It was, by a wide margin, the dominant hardware supplier the entire category was quietly built on top of, at one point striking exclusive supply arrangements with Bird, specifically, that reportedly cut off smaller competing scooter share startups from access to the same hardware pipeline. The financial scale of that supplier relationship is itself a detail almost entirely missing from the popular Segway failure narrative. By the time electric scooters had become a genuine global transportation category, revenue from Segway Ninebot's scooter business had grown into the hundreds of millions of dollars annually, dwarfing anything the original standalone Segway personal transporter had ever generated across its entire commercial lifespan. The original product that sold roughly 140,000 units across nearly 2 decades had been quietly succeeded by a technology platform moving that same volume of units in a matter of months, just wearing a different shape, carrying a different price tag, and living under a business model nobody at the original company had ever seriously pursued. Think about what that actually means for how this story should be told. The self-balancing gyroscopic technology Dean Kamen's team originally developed to help a robotic wheelchair climb a curb, technology that then became the $5,000 personal transporter that failed to become the next automobile, ended up, through an unrelated Chinese acquisition and a completely different business model, quietly powering a genuinely massive global industry. Every time someone unlocks a shared electric scooter on a city sidewalk today, in a very real technological sense, they're using a direct descendant of the same core engineering that powered the product everyone remembers exclusively as a punchline. So why does almost nobody tell the story this way? Part of it is narrative convenience. Brilliant Inventor's revolutionary product becomes overhyped failure, is a clean, satisfying arc with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and it fits neatly into the kind of 5 reasons listicle format that performs well as a piece of content. Failed product's underlying technology gets acquired by a rival, repurposed for a completely different use case, and becomes the invisible backbone of an industry nobody originally imagined it would power, is a messier, less tidy story, one that requires tracking a technology across a corporate acquisition and a genuine pivot in application, rather than ending cleanly at a bankruptcy filing or a discontinued product line. Part of it is also that the popular retrospective genre, built around this story, emerged and calcified years before the scooter share boom had fully connected itself back to Segway in the public consciousness. Many of the most viewed videos and articles cataloging the Segway's failure were made in the years immediately following the original product's commercial disappointment, well before Bird, Lime, and their competitors had scaled into the household names they are today, and well before the Segway Ninebot supplier relationship had become significant enough to warrant a mention in that older content. The narrative hardened into its familiar shape before the actual ending had even finished playing out, and once a narrative that clean and quotable exists, later creators tend to repeat its structure rather than revisit whether the underlying facts have moved on. The real lesson buried in the true version of this story isn't really about hype or marketing missteps, or an inventor who was better at engineering than he was at running a consumer products company. Although all of that genuinely happened and genuinely mattered. The real lesson is about how technology and companies aren't always the same thing, and how a corporate failure doesn't necessarily mean a technological one. Dean Kamen's engineering team solved a hard problem. How do you build a stable, self-balancing, motorized platform that a single person can safely ride? The company built around that solution failed to find the right price point, the right regulatory environment, and the right use case to make that specific product, at that specific price, into a mass market success. But the underlying solution to the hard engineering problem didn't fail at all. It just needed a different company, a different price point, and a different business model, rental instead of ownership, to finally find the market it had been looking for all along. This pattern shows up more often in technology history than most retrospective content tends to acknowledge, precisely because a clean failure story is so much more satisfying to tell than a messy handoff story. A piece of research or engineering developed for one purpose, inside one company, under one business model, sometimes only finds its real market years later, inside a completely different company, wearing a completely different shape. When that handoff happens quietly, through an acquisition or licensing deal rather than some dramatic public reveal, it's easy for the popular narrative to simply stop tracking the technology at the moment the original company stumbles, treating that stumble as the end of the story rather than as a midpoint pivot. The Segway is a particularly clean example of this pattern precisely because the visual continuity is so obvious in hindsight. A Segway and a rental electric scooter share an unmistakable family resemblance once you know to look for it. The same handlebar-mounted stance, the same underlying balance logic, the same basic silhouette, scaled down and stripped of its most expensive components. And yet for years, almost nobody watching either the Segway retrospectives or the scooter share industry coverage seems to have connected the two stories into a single, continuous thread. The Segway, as Dean Kamen originally envisioned and sold it, absolutely did fail. That part of the popular story is accurate and doesn't need correcting. But the idea that the Segway simply died in 2020 when production of the original device ended is where the popular version gets it wrong, because the technology didn't disappear when the company that built it lost its independence. It just changed its name, changed its price, changed its business model, and quietly became one of the most widely used pieces of personal transportation hardware in the modern world, standing on nearly every city sidewalk, mostly unrecognized for what it actually is. If you liked seeing how a story everyone thinks they already know turns out to have a completely different ending once you keep following the thread, that's exactly the kind of history this channel is built around. Subscribe if you want more of these, and let us know in the comments which brand's failure story you'd want us to dig into next, because odds are good the popular version isn't the whole story there either.